I walked into my daughter's kitchen that Sunday night and smelled burnt garlic, the same smell that used to comfort me when her father was alive. But this time, it meant something was wrong. Before I could even set down my purse, I heard the slap, sharp, final, and watched Clara crumple to the floor like she'd been shot. Her mother-in-law didn't gasp or scream. She clapped. "That's how she learns respect," she said, smiling like it was a lesson, not a crime. They thought they'd broken us. They had no idea I'd already dialed Detective Ruiz and was recording everything. Friends, before we dive into this story, I want to ask for a small favor. If you've ever watched someone you love disappear right in front of your eyes, please subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment telling me your city or country. Your voice matters, especially if silence has been your shield for too long. I walked into Clara's kitchen and smelled burnt garlic. Her favorite sign something was wrong, just as Richard slapped her across the face for spilling water on the tablecloth. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot, sharp and final. Clara's head snapped to the side, her hand flying to her cheek, and then her knees gave out. She didn't cry out. She just folded, slow and quiet, like she'd done it before. My purse hit the floor, but I didn't move. Not for 3 full seconds. I stood there watching my daughter, my brilliant, careful Clara, crumple like paper on the marble, her eyes wide and empty, like she'd already checked out of her own body. And then I heard it, clapping, slow, deliberate, from the head of the table. Eleanor, Richard's mother, sat there in her pearl earrings and silk blouse, smiling like she'd just watched a child learn to tie her shoes. "That's how you teach a wife," she said, voice sweet as syrup. My chest locked up so hard I thought I might pass out. But my hands, my God, my hands didn't shake. They went straight to my pocket, pulled out my phone, and I dialed Ruiz before I even knew I was doing it. My thumb hit send, and I just stood there, staring at Eleanor, waiting. The ring on the other end felt like an eternity. Richard hadn't moved. He stood over Clara like he was waiting for her to get up and apologize. Like this was normal. Like this was Tuesday. And maybe it was. Maybe this happened every Tuesday, and I just never saw it, because I was too busy pretending everything was fine since James died. Ruiz answered on the 3rd ring. "Margaret," he said, voice low, like he already knew. "Domestic violence in progress," I said. My voice didn't crack, didn't tremble. Sounded like I was ordering groceries. 345 Oak Ridge Lane, kitchen. I'm a direct witness. Victim is on the floor. Perpetrator is present. Accomplice is clapping. Eleanor's smile faltered. Richard finally turned to me, eyes wide with that fake confusion abusers wear so well. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed. I didn't answer. Just hit speakerphone and set the phone on the counter. "Repeat what you just did," I said, looking straight at him. "Go on, do it again. I've got all night." His face went white. Eleanor's mouth opened, then shut. Ruiz was already talking in the background. "Units en route, stay calm, do not engage." But I wasn't listening. I was watching Clara. She hadn't moved. Just lay there, trembling, eyes fixed on the ceiling like she was counting tiles to stay in her body. I crossed the room in 3 steps and knelt beside her. The floor was cold under my knees. "Clara," I whispered. She blinked once, then turned her head to look at me. Her lip was split. A thin line of blood ran down her chin. I reached for her, slow like you would with a spooked animal. She flinched, just a little, but she let me take her hand. Her skin was ice. "You don't have to go back," I said, low, right into her ear so only she could hear. Her breath hitched. Tears started then, silent, fast, like she'd been holding them in for months, maybe years. I didn't look at Richard, didn't look at Eleanor. I kept my eyes locked on my daughter, on the bruise already blooming under her eye, on the way her fingers trembled against mine. I remembered her at 5, scared of thunder, hiding under the kitchen table until James sang that stupid cowboy song to coax her out. Now she was 32 and hiding under a different kind of storm, and I'd been too blind, too wrapped up in my own grief, to see it coming. The sirens started in the distance, faint at first, then louder. Richard finally moved, stepping toward me like he was going to grab the phone. "Don't," I said, voice flat. Touch me and it's 3 more felonies. Obstruction, assault on a witness, threat. He stopped, his hands balled into fists. Eleanor stood up then, smoothing her blouse like she was getting ready to leave a dinner party. This is a family matter, she said, voice tight. You have no right. It came out harsh, ugly, but I didn't care. A family matter? You just watched your son beat my daughter and clapped like it was a fucking performance. I stood, pulling Clara up with me. She leaned into me hard, her weight almost knocking me off balance. I held her tight. I'm a direct witness to a felony, I said, keeping my voice steady, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. And you, Eleanor, just admitted to justifying and celebrating it. That makes you an accomplice. 4 years, minimum if this goes federal. Her face went slack. For the first time, she looked scared. Good. Richard was pacing now, muttering under his breath. This is bullshit. She's crazy. She provoked me. The same tired script I'd heard from 100 men in courtrooms and shelters. But this wasn't a courtroom. This was my daughter's kitchen. And they'd made the mistake of thinking I was just a sad old widow who'd stop asking questions if you handed her a cup of tea. The sirens were close now. Headlights swept across the window. 3 patrol cars. I recognized Ruiz's tall frame before he even stepped out of the lead vehicle. He moved fast, purposeful, his eyes scanning the room the second he crossed the threshold. Margaret, he said, nodding at me. Then his gaze dropped to Clara. His jaw tightened. He didn't say another word, just turned to Richard. Sir, you have the right to remain silent. He didn't resist, just kept repeating. She's lying. She's unstable. Ask her about the pregnancy. My stomach dropped. Clara hadn't told me she was pregnant. Not yet. But Richard knew, and he was already using it as a weapon. Ruiz ignored him, turning to Eleanor. Ma'am, you're also under arrest for aiding and abetting, verbal encouragement of domestic violence, and witness tampering. She gasped like he'd slapped her. You can't. I'm his mother. Ruiz didn't flinch. That doesn't make you immune to the law. They led them out together, Richard glancing back at Clara with this look, part fury, part panic, part something else I couldn't name. Eleanor kept her head high, but her hands were shaking. The minute the door closed behind them, Clara sagged against me. The dam broke. She sobbed into my shoulder, great heaving breaths that sounded like they were tearing her apart from the inside. I held her as tight as I could, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other rubbing slow circles on her back. It's over, I whispered, even though I knew it wasn't. Not really. It's over, baby. I've got you. She cried for what felt like hours, right there in that ruined kitchen, the smell of burnt garlic still hanging in the air, the broken water glass still on the floor. By the time the last officer left, the kitchen was quiet except for Clara's shaky breathing. I made her sit at the table, her chair, not the one she'd fallen from, and got a cold pack from the freezer. She let me press it to her face without flinching this time. Her eyes were red, swollen, but clearer. Why didn't you tell me? I asked softly. She looked down at her hands. I was ashamed, she whispered. You've spent your whole life rescuing women like me. How was I supposed to tell you I became one? I wanted to argue, to say she wasn't like them, that she was my daughter, that it wasn't her fault. But I knew better. Shame doesn't listen to logic. It feeds on silence. So I just nodded. It ends tonight, I said. She looked up at me, eyes searching my face like she was memorizing it. What if he gets out? He won't, I said, and I meant it. Not because I trusted the system, I'd seen too much to believe that, but because I wouldn't let him. I'd spent years vanishing from my own son, learning how to disappear, how to rebuild, how to fight in the dark. Now I'd use every ounce of that knowledge to keep Clara safe. The cops had taken statements, collected the glass, photographed the bruise, but I knew the real work was just beginning. The lawyers, the restraining orders, the money he'd probably hidden, the baby growing inside her that he'd already started using as leverage. This wasn't just a dinner anymore. It was a war. And I was done pretending. I reached across the table and took Clara's hand. Her fingers closed around mine, tight. For the first time in a long time, she didn't look afraid. She looked ready. And so was I. Clara slept in my guest room that first night, wrapped in an old flannel shirt of James's, the one with the frayed cuffs he used to wear on winter mornings when he'd make coffee and read the paper by the window. She curled into the far side of the twin bed like she was trying to disappear into the mattress. Every time a car passed on the street outside, her whole body jerked. Not just startled, full-on flinched, like she expected someone to crash through the door. I stood in the hallway for a long time, watching her through the cracked door, my chest tight with something sharp and useless. Guilt. I should have seen it. I should have asked more when she stopped coming over as often, when her voice on the phone got quieter, thinner, like she was always holding her breath. But I didn't. I told myself she was just busy, grieving James, adjusting to marriage. All those lies we tell ourselves so we don't have to face the truth, that the person we love is being hurt, and we're doing nothing. I finally went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. I didn't know what else to do. Tea felt stupid, useless, but it was something to do with my hands. I carried 2 mugs back, the steam curling into the dark hallway, and set one on the nightstand without saying a word. She didn't look at me at first, just stared at the ceiling, blinking fast. Then she sat up, slow, like her bones ached, and wrapped both hands around the mug like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She sipped the tea, chamomile, the kind James always said calmed nerves, and for a minute, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, like the air before a storm breaks. Then, without looking at me, she pushed the sleeve of James's shirt up past her elbow. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry out. But my stomach dropped like I'd missed a step on the stairs. On her upper arm, just below the shoulder, were 5 perfect bruises, purple at the center, yellow at the edges, shaped exactly like fingers. Someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave a map of their hand on her skin. "He says it's because I don't listen," she whispered, her voice so low I almost didn't catch it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive back to that house right then and tear Richard apart with my bare hands. But I stayed still, sat on the edge of the bed, reached out slow, and covered her hand with mine. "You listen too much, baby," I said. "That's the problem." She finally looked at me, her eyes glassy and wide, and that's when she said it, the thing that made my blood go cold all over again. "I'm 6 weeks pregnant." The mug in my hand almost slipped. 6 weeks. That meant she'd told him before James's funeral. I remembered that night. Richard standing by the casket, one hand on Clara's back, his other arm wrapped around her like he owned her. He'd leaned in and whispered something that made her stiffen, and I'd chalked it up to grief. But now I remembered the way his eyes lit up when she told him, the way he started talking about family names and legacy at the reception, like he'd just been handed a prize. He wasn't excited about a baby. He was excited about control. I put the mug down and stood up, needing to move, needing to do something besides sit there feeling helpless. I paced the small room, my slippers shushing against the rug. "He's using the baby," I said, more to myself than to her. "He thinks this locks you in, like you won't leave because of the child." Clara nodded, tears spilling over now, silent and fast. "He said the baby needs a stable home, that I'd be selfish to break up the family." I stopped pacing, turned to her. "A stable home? Clara, a home where the father hits the mother isn't stable. It's a cage." She flinched again, not at my voice, but at the word hits, like she still couldn't bring herself to call it what it was. I sat back down, took both her hands this time. "You didn't do anything wrong. You never did. He's the one who's broken." She shook her head. "But what if the baby will be safe," I cut in, firm, "because you're getting out, tonight, and you're not going back." She looked at me like she wanted to believe it, but fear had sunk its claws deep. "He'll find me," she whispered. "Not if I have anything to say about it," I said. And for the first time since James died, I felt that old fire, the one that kept me going when I was sleeping on couches and working 3 jobs. The one that made me study nursing on the bus. I wasn't just a widow, I was a mother. And mothers fight. And I stayed in the guest room with her the rest of that night. Not on the bed, just in the armchair by the window, watching the street, listening to every sound. When her breathing finally evened out into sleep, I let myself cry, quietly, into my sleeve, so she wouldn't hear. I cried for the months I'd missed, for the times I'd let her brush off my questions with a tired smile, for the way I'd assumed she was handling things like a grown woman should. But she wasn't just a grown woman. She was my daughter, and I'd failed her. The worst part? Richard knew that. He knew I'd trust Clara to speak up if things were really bad. He knew I'd assume she wouldn't stay if she were in danger. That's why he kept it just under the surface. Just enough control, just enough fear, just enough shame to keep her quiet. And it worked, but not anymore. I watched the sky go from black to gray outside the window, the streetlights flickering off one by one. By the time the first bird started calling, I'd made up my mind. No more gentle questions, no more waiting for her to figure things out. She was 6 weeks pregnant, bruised, and terrified. That wasn't a marriage. That was a hostage situation, and I wasn't leaving without her. Morning came soft and quiet. Clara woke before I did, sitting up slowly, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. I didn't ask if she was okay, because she wasn't, and pretending otherwise wouldn't help. Instead, I stood and went to the closet, pulled out an old duffel bag, the same one I'd used when I had nothing, and started packing. Jeans, socks, underwear, her favorite sweater, the framed ultrasound photo from her last appointment, I'd seen it on her dresser, and James's flannel shirt. She watched me in silence, then finally stood and came over. "Where are we going?" she asked, voice rough with sleep and tears. "Not we," I said. "You. I've got a friend, Marlene. She runs a women's shelter downtown. Safe, private. No one knows about it unless they need to." Clara's eyes widened. "A shelter? Mom, I can't." "You can," I said, zipping the bag. "And you will. Because if you go back, he'll use that baby like a leash. He'll tell you you're unstable. He'll say you abandoned your child. He'll make you doubt everything you know is true." I turned to face her, took her shoulders. "But you didn't ask for this. You don't owe him your life. Not for a house, not for a name, not even for a baby." Her breath hitched. "What if I'm not strong enough?" "You don't have to be strong," I said. "You just have to be gone." I didn't hug her yet, didn't say anything sweet, because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something long and hard, but it was hers. I looked her in the eyes, the way I used to when she was little and scared of thunder. "You don't go back," I said. "Not for clothes, not for pictures, not even for your wedding ring. You leave it all, because none of it matters next to your life." She nodded, swallowed hard, and stepped onto the porch. I locked the front door behind us, turned the deadbolt, and walked her to the car. As we drove away from my house, she stared out the window, silent, but her grip on the duffel never loosened. And I knew, by morning, I'd decided, no more half measures. I was getting her out for good. Not just out of that house, out of his reach, out of his story, into one where she and that baby got to breathe. While Clara napped, I tiptoed into her kitchen trying not to make a sound. My back ached from sleeping in that stiff armchair all night, and my head pounded from too much coffee and not enough sleep. I just needed painkillers, any kind. I opened the medicine cabinet first. Empty, except for floss and an old tube of toothpaste. So I turned to the cabinets above the stove, the ones she always kept organized. Flour, sugar, cinnamon. I moved the flour container and almost dropped it when I saw what was behind it. A small gray metal box with a cheap padlock. It looked out of place, like something hidden in plain sight. My heart started thudding in my chest. I glanced toward the hallway. Clara was still asleep, her breathing slow and even. I grabbed the butter knife from the dish rack, slipped it under the lock, and twisted. It took 2 tries before the metal snapped with a quiet pop. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from that cold, coiled rage I only felt when someone I loved was being used. Inside the box were bank statements, printed emails, and a notepad filled with dates and numbers. The most recent statement showed a joint account, Clara and Richard, with a balance of 270 €. 2 months ago, it had $87,431. The money hadn't just vanished. It had been transferred in 3 clean installments to something called Eleanor Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. I scrolled through the printed emails with numb fingers. One from Richard to his mother. If anyone asks, say Clara's been stressed. Blame hormones. Say she's not herself lately. Make it sound like it's all in her head. Another. She's too trusting. She hasn't even checked the account since we moved. I sank to the tile floor, the cold seeping through my jeans. This wasn't a marriage falling apart. This was a setup, a long con. And Clara had been played from the beginning. I sat there for what felt like forever, staring at the papers in my lap like they might rearrange themselves into something less cruel. But they didn't. Every line, every transfer, every rehearsed lie. It all pointed to one thing. Richard never loved her. He saw her as a target. A woman with inheritance, a steady job, a quiet nature that wouldn't raise alarms. And Eleanor? She wasn't just enabling him. She was running the operation. Eleanor Holdings. The name alone made my stomach twist. I thought back to that night at dinner, how she clapped like it was a performance, how she said, that's how she learns respect, like she'd done this before. Maybe she had. Maybe this was their routine. Find a vulnerable woman, isolate her, bleed her dry, and when she cracked under pressure, blame her for being unstable. The genius of it was how clean it looked from the outside. No shouting matches in public. No visible bruises at first. Just a wife who wasn't herself, a husband who tried so hard, and a mother-in-law who just wanted what was best. I balled my fist around the butter knife, my knuckles white. All those months I'd hesitated to push Clara, thinking I was respecting her boundaries. But I wasn't. I was letting them win. I should have asked more, should have insisted on seeing her alone, should have trusted my gut the first time I saw her pull that long sleeve over a warm March day. Now I had proof. Not just of violence, but of calculated theft, emotional manipulation, and conspiracy. This wasn't just about saving Clara from a slap. It was about pulling her out of a trap that had been years in the making. I stood up slowly, my knees stiff, and carried the entire box to the dining room table. I spread everything out like evidence in a case I couldn't afford to lose. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Marlene's name. We hadn't spoken in 5 years, not since I helped her secure funding for the shelter after her own escape, but I knew she'd answer. She always did for women in trouble. The phone rang twice. Marlene, it's Margaret Holloway, I said, voice low but urgent. I need your help, right now. She didn't ask questions, just said, tell me. I filled her in fast. Richard, the slapping, the pregnancy, the bruises, the isolation. Then I told her about the box. He didn't just hit her, I said. He's been stealing from her, laundering money through his mother's fake company, coaching Eleanor on how to gaslight the neighbors. Marlene was quiet for a beat. Is she safe where she is? For now, she's sleeping. But he knows she left. He'll come looking. Bring her to the Cedar Street house, Marlene said. It's off the grid, no public address, unlisted phone. I'll have a room ready in 20 minutes. I glanced toward the hallway again. She's 6 weeks pregnant, I added, my voice catching. She's scared. And she's ashamed. Then tell her shame doesn't live in this house, Marlene said gently. Only safety does. I hung up, took a deep breath, and started stuffing the documents back into the metal box. I wouldn't leave any of it behind. This wasn't just evidence, it was the blueprint of their cruelty, and I was going to use every page of it to burn their whole operation down. I didn't know how long I stood there folding the papers, tucking them back into that stupid box. But it was long enough that the sun had shifted across the kitchen floor, painting stripes of light over the spot where Clara had fallen. I thought about how many times she must have cleaned that floor after crying there, how many times she'd made dinner with trembling hands while Richard watched like a hawk, waiting for her to slip up. And Eleanor, sitting at that table like a queen, judging every bite, every word, every breath. They hadn't just taken her money. They'd taken her joy, her confidence, her voice, and they'd made her think it was her fault. I snapped the box shut and tucked it under my arm. I washed the butter knife, wiped the cabinet, and put the flour back exactly as I'd found it. No point tipping them off early. Let Richard think he still had control. Let him believe Clara was just emotional and would come crawling back once she calmed down. He didn't know I'd seen the transfers. Didn't know I'd read his script for his mother. Didn't know that a woman who'd survived sleeping on couches, working 3 jobs, and raising kids on bus rides didn't scare easy. I walked back to the guest room, box hidden behind my back, and peeked in. Clara was still asleep, one hand resting on her stomach, the other clutching the edge of the blanket. She looked so young like that, just a girl who wanted to be loved, who thought saying yes would keep the peace. I stepped back into the hallway and dialed Marlene again. "We're coming in an hour," I said. "Is there space for 2? I'm not leaving her alone." "There's always space for you, Margaret," she said. And just like that, I knew where we were headed, not just to a shelter, but to the first real step toward freedom. I went back to the kitchen and made a thermos of strong black coffee, packed 2 changes of clothes for Clara, her prenatal vitamins, and the photo of her and James from her graduation, still in its frame. I didn't take jewelry or shoes or makeup. None of that mattered now. What mattered was getting her out with her dignity intact. I left a note on the counter. "Gone for a drive, back soon." Vague enough to buy us time, clear enough to avoid panic calls. When I returned to the guest room, Clara was stirring. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the light. "Mom?" she whispered, voice rough with sleep. "Hey," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I made coffee, and I called Marlene." Her eyes widened. "The shelter?" I nodded. "Cedar Street. It's safe, private. No one knows you're there unless you tell them." She sat up, hugging the blanket to her chest. "I don't know if I can—" "You don't have to know yet," I cut in. "Just get in the car. Just come with me for today. You can decide what's next later." She looked down at her hands. "What if he finds us?" "He won't," I said firmly, "because this place isn't listed, and I'm not telling anyone where we're going, not even Sarah." She took a shaky breath. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay." I handed her the coffee. Her fingers trembled around the mug. "Did you find the painkillers?" she asked. I almost laughed. "No," I said, "but I found something worse." I didn't explain. Not yet. She'd see the box soon enough. For now, she just needed to move. By the time we pulled out of the driveway, Clara was buckled in with her duffel at her feet and the metal box on her lap. She hadn't opened it, but she kept touching it like it might disappear. I drove slowly at first, checking mirrors, taking back streets. The city felt different, lighter somehow, like the air itself knew we were leaving something behind. Clara stared out the window in silence until we hit the highway. Then she turned to me, eyes red but clear. "What was in the box, Mom?" I kept my eyes on the road. "Proof," I said, "that this was never about love. It was about control, about money, about making you small so they could take everything and still look like the good guys." She opened the box then, right there in the passenger seat. I watched her face as she read the emails, saw the account numbers, traced the name Eleanor Holdings with her finger. Her breath hitched once, sharp and quiet, but she didn't cry. She just closed the box, set it on the floor, and said, "Okay," just like that. No denial, no bargaining, just acceptance and resolve. I reached over and squeezed her hand. "We're not going back," I said. "Not ever." She nodded. "Not ever." And for the first time since that dinner, I believed we might actually mean it. At the shelter, Clara finally told me the truth. Richard had been threatening to take the baby if she left, saying her history of instability would make her unfit in court. We were sitting on thin cots in a small room that smelled like bleach and old laundry detergent. Rain tapped against the window, soft but insistent, like it was listening. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "He says I'm not stable enough to raise a child alone, that my family has problems." Then she looked at me, eyes wide and scared, and said, "He knows about Richard." My stomach dropped. She meant my son, the one who stole my social security number, maxed out my credit, threatened to burn my house down, and is now serving 3 years in Huntsville. I'd spent years burying that shame, telling Clara never to mention him, never to put it in writing, never to bring it up around strangers. "It stays in this family," I'd said. "It protects you." But now I saw it for what it really was. I'd handed Richard a loaded gun and pointed it straight at her. I felt my face go hot. Shame, guilt, all of it crashing down like bricks. I looked away, out the rain-streaked window, because I couldn't bear to see the fear in her eyes, knowing I'd helped put it there. For years, I thought I was shielding her. I told her to keep quiet, because I didn't want her judged, didn't want her labeled that girl with the criminal brother. I thought silence was armor. But all it did was give Richard ammunition. He'd done his homework, found old court records, maybe even talked to someone who knew our past. And now he was using it like a leash. Stay, or I'll tell the judge your family breeds liars and thieves. Clara reached for my hand. Mom, I didn't know what to do. He said if I left, I'd never see the baby again. I squeezed her fingers hard, trying to hold back the tears that burned behind my eyes. This wasn't just fear. It was my fault. My silence had made her vulnerable. My secrets had become his strategy. I didn't cry in front of her. Not then. I waited until I was alone in the shelter's tiny bathroom, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. My eyes were red-rimmed, my jaw tight. I splashed cold water on my face, but it didn't wash away the truth. I'd spent my whole life teaching women to speak up, to name the abuse, to break the silence. And yet, when it came to my own family, I'd clamped my lips shut like a scared child. That hypocrisy sat heavy in my chest. Outside, a car door slammed. I flinched before remembering where I was. Safe, for now. But safe wasn't enough. Richard wasn't just hitting her. He was planning, calculating, weaponizing every piece of our past he could find. And if he knew about my son, what else did he know? How deep had he dug? I dried my face with a scratchy paper towel and made a decision right there. No more shadows. If he wanted to play dirty, fine. But I knew how to dig deeper. That night, after Clara fell asleep, her breathing finally even, one hand resting on her stomach, I slipped out of the shelter and got in my car. The rain had let up, leaving the streets slick and quiet. I drove to the county records office downtown. It was closed, but I knew the clerk, Denise, from my old nonprofit days. I called her from the payphone outside the shelter. Denise, it's Margaret Holloway. I need access, tonight. She didn't ask why. Just said, be there in 20. When she unlocked the side door, she didn't hug me or offer small talk, just nodded and handed me a stack of file folders. Richard Langston, I said, and Eleanor Holdings. She raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. I sat at a dim metal desk under flickering fluorescent lights and started pulling documents. Incorporation papers, tax filings, property transfers. Every page confirmed what I'd suspected. This wasn't just a business. It was a laundering machine. And Richard wasn't just my daughter's husband. He was a thief in a tailored suit. My hands didn't shake as I made copies. They were steady, cold, ready. Back in the car, I spread the papers across the passenger seat. Rain started again, light this time, whispering against the windshield. I traced the name Eleanor Holdings with my finger, then flipped to a deed showing Richard had transferred Clara's inheritance, money from James's life insurance, into an offshore account. He'd been planning this for months, maybe longer, and he'd used our silence as cover. I thought about how Clara used to talk about starting a family, how she'd picked out baby names weeks before James died. She'd believed Richard loved her, and all this time he'd been treating her like a bank account with a heartbeat. The rage came then, not hot, but deep, like a river under ice. I started the car and drove slowly back toward the shelter. No more protecting her from the truth. The truth was the only thing that could save her now. I'd spent years vanishing. From my son, from creditors, from my own pain. But this time, I wouldn't disappear. I'd stand right in the open, documents in hand, and make sure Richard knew exactly who he'd messed with. By the time I pulled into the shelter's lot, the sky was gray with dawn. I gathered the papers into a neat stack and tucked them under my coat like they were sacred. Inside, Clara was still asleep, curled on her side, one knee drawn up like she was protecting the baby even in her dreams. I sat on the edge of the cot and watched her breathe. This wasn't just about exposing Richard's fraud anymore. It was about proving Clara wasn't unstable. She was being hunted by a man who saw vulnerability as weakness and silence as surrender. I wouldn't let him twist our past into a weapon. Not again. I leaned down and kissed her forehead, whispering so low she wouldn't hear. "I'm sorry I taught you to hide. From now on, we fight in the light." Then I stood, squared my shoulders, and walked back out into the morning. It was time to stop hiding. Time to build a case so solid, so undeniable, that no judge, no lawyer, no manipulative mother-in-law could ever convince anyone Clara didn't deserve to raise her child in peace. And I'd start by showing her exactly what I'd found, so she'd never doubt her own strength again. I met a private investigator named Lena in the fluorescent glare of a Walmart parking lot at 11 p.m., the kind of place no one pays attention to strangers. Just tired moms pushing carts and teenagers sneaking cigarettes behind the garden section. I'd parked near the back, under a flickering light that buzzed like an angry hornet. My hands were cold, but not from fear, from focus. When Lena's sedan rolled in, she didn't turn off the engine, just got out in a dark jacket and jeans, her hair pulled back tight, eyes scanning the lot like she'd done this 100 times before. She walked straight to my car without a word, leaned over the hood, and slid a thick manila envelope toward me. "Everything you asked for," she said, voice low. No smile, no small talk, just business. I opened it right there under that buzzing light and saw it all. Photos of Richard shaking hands with a notary outside a downtown office, copies of a quitclaim deed with Clara's forged signature, and a typed list with names, dates, and case numbers. 3 women who dated Richard before Clara, all of whom filed domestic violence reports that later vanished from the system after cash payments. I flipped through the pages slowly, my breath steady even as my stomach turned. One of the women, a nurse named Tanya, had a restraining order granted in 2019, dismissed 2 weeks later after a mutual agreement. Another, Marissa, reported strangulation during an argument. Case closed for lack of evidence, despite ER photos. The third never even made it to court. She'd moved out of state within days of filing. Richard didn't just repeat his behavior. He had a system. And now I had proof he'd been planning this long before Clara ever said, "I do." I looked up at Lena. Did he pay them off himself? She nodded. Through shell accounts. Same pattern as the house transfer. He's slick but sloppy when you know where to dig. I handed her the cash, $800 in 20s, from the mason jar I kept buried in my laundry basket, the one labeled emergency only. She counted it fast, tucked it into her coat, and gave a single nod. "If you need more, text the burner number I gave you. Don't call." Then she was gone, back in her car and out of the lot before I'd even zipped the envelope shut. I sat in my car for a full minute after she left, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the envelope on the passenger seat like it might bite me. But it didn't. It just sat there, solid, heavy, real. No more guessing. No more wondering if Clara was overreacting or if I was exaggerating. This was cold, hard evidence that Richard wasn't just abusive, he was predatory. And Eleanor? She wasn't just enabling him, she was bankrolling him. The quitclaim deed proved it. He'd moved to steal the house the second Clara told him she was pregnant, like he needed to lock her in before she could walk away. I thought of Clara sleeping in my guest room, one hand resting on her belly, flinching at every car that passed. She hadn't just married a cruel man. She'd married a con artist who saw her inheritance, her kindness, and her baby as assets to control. My chest didn't tighten with panic this time. It burned with purpose. I started the car, tucked the envelope under my seat, and drove home with my eyes locked on the road, every stoplight a ticking clock. When I pulled into my driveway, the house was dark except for a sliver of light under Clara's door. I let myself in quietly, but she must have heard the car because she was already sitting up in bed when I peeked in. Her hair was messy, her face pale, but her eyes were alert. "Did you find anything?" she whispered. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and kissed her forehead, warm, soft, just like I did when she was little and scared of storms. "More than I wanted to," I said, "but it's good. It's what we need." She didn't ask for details, just nodded and curled back under the blanket, her hand drifting back to her stomach like she was guarding something precious. And she was. I stood there for a moment, watching her breathe, the rise and fall of her chest slow and even, and I made a silent promise. No more half-truths, no more waiting for the system to catch up. I would build a wall around her so thick, so high, that neither Richard nor Eleanor would ever touch her again. Back in my bedroom, I spread the contents of the envelope across my desk. Photos on the left, documents in the center, the list of women on the right. I grabbed my laptop, opened a new document, and started typing. Not a letter, not a plea, a restraining order. I named Richard first, full name, date of birth, last known address. Then, without hesitation, I typed Eleanor's name next to his. Eleanor Whitmore, co-conspirator in acts of financial fraud, emotional coercion, and active encouragement of domestic violence. I cited the quitclaim deed, the forged signature, the pattern of erased police reports. I listed myself as the affiant, direct witness to assault and verbal incitement. My fingers flew across the keys, no tremor, no second-guessing. Every word was a brick, every sentence a nail. This wasn't just about keeping them away from Clara. It was about naming what they'd done, not as family drama, but as criminal conspiracy. When I hit save, I titled the file Protection Order Final V1, though I knew there'd be more versions, more evidence, more layers to peel back. But this was the foundation. And for the first time since that dinner, I felt like I wasn't reacting. I was building. I stayed up until 3 a.m., refining the language, checking legal wording against templates from my old nonprofit days, making sure every claim was backed by something concrete. When I finally shut the laptop, my eyes were dry and my back ached, but my mind was clear. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window looking out at the empty street. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably pacing his mother's guest room, furious that Clara hadn't come crawling back. And Eleanor was likely on the phone with her lawyers, spinning a story about a delusional daughter-in-law and a meddling mother. But they didn't know I had their playbook now. They didn't know I'd seen the names of the women before Clara, the ones they'd erased. And they didn't know I'd already emailed a copy of everything to Detective Ruiz with the subject line, New Evidence, Co-Conspirator Involvement. I went back to my desk, printed 2 copies of the draft, and tucked one into the metal box with the bank statements. The other I left on top, ready for the courthouse in the morning. My hands didn't shake this time. They never would again. In court, Richard wore a tailored suit and cried about misunderstandings, his voice cracking like he was the victim, not the man who'd backhanded my daughter hard enough to knock her into the refrigerator. He kept glancing at the judge like he expected her to nod, to smile, to excuse him the way his mother always had. Clara's under a lot of stress, he said, dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief. She's hormonal, especially now that she's pregnant. I was just trying to calm her down. I didn't flinch. I just kept my hands folded in my lap, the phone already unlocked in my pocket. Clara sat beside me, so still she barely seemed to breathe. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the bench. The judge, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense bun, listened without expression. When Richard finished his little performance, she turned to me. "Ms. Holloway, you're the witness. Do you have anything to add?" I stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. I have audio from that night." I pulled out my phone, tapped play, and set it on the podium. The room went quiet as the recording filled the space. The sharp smack of skin on skin, Clara's gasp, the thud as she hit the floor, and then, clear as glass, Eleanor's voice. "Good. That's how she learns respect." Her eyes narrowed. She leaned forward slightly, like she was bracing herself. Richard's face went slack. He looked at his mother in the front row, but Eleanor wasn't clapping now. She sat rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands clenched in her lap like she was trying to disappear into her own skin. Clara's fingers found mine then, and she gripped so hard I felt her nails dig into my palm. I didn't pull away. I let her hold on as tightly as she needed. The recording ended. Silence stretched. The judge looked from Richard to Eleanor to me, then finally to Clara. "Ms. Langston," she said softly, "did this happen?" Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady. "Yes, Your Honor. Not kind of. Not, it wasn't that bad. Just yes." The word hung in the air like a truth too heavy to ignore. The judge nodded once, then turned back to Richard. Mr. Langston, your statement about calming her down directly contradicts the evidence. You assaulted your wife in front of 2 witnesses, one of whom, she added, glancing at Eleanor, verbally endorsed the violence. Save it for your attorney. She flipped through the file, then looked at me. Ms. Holloway, you're requesting emergency custody and a 500-foot restraining order pending full hearing? Yes, Your Honor, I said. My daughter is 6 weeks pregnant. She has no safe place to return to. And based on evidence I've submitted, bank transfers, forged documents, prior threats, I believe both she and the unborn child are in immediate danger. The judge didn't hesitate. Motion granted. Full temporary custody to Ms. Langston. Mr. Langston is prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Ms. Langston or Ms. Holloway. Violation will result in immediate arrest. I felt Clara exhale beside me, like she'd been holding her breath for months. She leaned into my shoulder just slightly, and I covered her hand with mine, giving it a squeeze. Across the aisle, Eleanor hadn't moved. But when I looked at her, really looked, her eyes were wide. Not furious, not defiant, afraid. I studied her face as the bailiff read Richard his conditions. Her makeup was perfect, her blouse crisp, her pearls gleaming, but her hands trembled. She glanced at me, just once, and quickly looked away. That's when I knew. They'd thought we were broken. They thought Clara would crumble, that I'd stay quiet out of shame or denial or some outdated idea of keeping family matters private. They didn't know I'd spent 30 years sleeping on couches, working 3 jobs, studying on buses, vanishing from my own son's shadow. They didn't know I'd learned how to read a room, how to collect evidence, how to wait until the exact right moment to strike. Richard had mistaken my silence for weakness. Eleanor had confused my grief for surrender. But sitting there in that courtroom, watching fear flicker in the eyes of a woman who once clapped at violence, I felt something cold and quiet settle inside me. Certainty. This wasn't just about a house or money or even custody. This was about breaking a pattern they thought would last forever. After the hearing, Clara and I walked out into the courthouse hallway without saying a word. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, washing everything in gold. She stopped near the door, took a deep breath, and finally let go of my hand. He looked at me like I betrayed him, she said, voice shaking. Like I was the one who ruined everything. I turned to her. Because you left the script. You stopped playing the part he wrote for you. She nodded, tears welling but not falling. Inside, Richard was being escorted out by a bailiff. He didn't look at us. Eleanor followed behind, shoulders stiff, head high, but her steps were slower now, less sure. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt clarity. This was just the first battle. There would be appeals, hidden assets, smear campaigns, maybe even threats. But today, we'd drawn a line in the courtroom floor and they'd stepped over it. And the system, flawed, slow, imperfect, had finally caught up. Back in the car, Clara stared out the window as I pulled away from the courthouse. What do we do now? She asked. We go home, I said. We eat something warm. We rest. She was quiet for a minute, then turned to me. Mom, thank you for not letting me go back. I reached over and squeezed her knee, eased. You're not alone in this, I said. Not anymore. She leaned her head against the seat and closed her eyes. In the rearview mirror, I watched the courthouse shrink behind us. Eleanor's fear hadn't been about losing control. It was about realizing she never really had it. Because surviving isn't the same as hiding, and I'd stopped hiding a long time ago. 3 weeks after the hearing, my landline rang at 2 a.m., sharp and shrill in the dead quiet of the house. I was already half awake. Sleep had been light since that night at the dinner table. But this sound cut through me like ice. I reached for the corded phone on the nightstand, knowing it wasn't Clara. She only used her cell. Hello? I said, voice low. His voice came through, thick and slurred like he'd been drinking, maybe crying, maybe both. You took everything from me. Richard. My stomach dropped, but I didn't flinch. You think you won? He hissed. I know where Clara goes every Tuesday. My blood turned cold. Tuesdays. Her prenatal checkups. I'd driven her myself last week. He'd been watching. Maybe someone had tipped him off, Or maybe he'd been following us. I kept my voice flat, calm, like I was reading a grocery list. If you come within 500 feet of her, you'll go back to jail in cuffs. And this time, I'll make sure they charge you with conspiracy, witness intimidation, and stalking. Violate that order, and you'll be in prison until your hair turns gray. I didn't wait for a reply. I hung up, hard. I sat on the edge of the bed for a full minute, listening to my own heartbeat. Then I dialed Ruiz. He answered on the second ring, voice alert like he'd been expecting trouble. "It was Richard," I said. Direct threat. Mentioned Clara's Tuesday routine. Sounded drunk, maybe desperate. Ruiz didn't waste words. "Did you record it?" "Landline." "No, but I remember every word." "Good enough. I'll get a patrol car to your block within 10. Don't leave the house." "I won't," I said, though I already knew I would. I walked to Clara's room and stood in the doorway watching her sleep. One hand rested on her stomach, the other tucked under her cheek. She looked peaceful, too peaceful for what was coming. I didn't wake her. Not yet. But I went to the kitchen, filled a thermos with coffee, and packed a go bag. Her prenatal vitamins, the ultrasound photo, James's old flannel, cash from the jar, and my pepper spray. If he knew her schedule, he knew this address. We weren't safe here anymore. By 2:30 a.m., a patrol car idled at the end of the street, its lights off, but engine running. I watched from the living room window, curtains cracked just enough to see. My hands were steady, but my mind raced. Had he seen us leave the clinic? Had someone talked? Did Eleanor have eyes in the neighborhood? It didn't matter. What mattered was getting Clara somewhere he couldn't find her. I thought about Marlene's shelter, but it was already on his radar. We needed a clean break, a place even I didn't know yet. I remembered a woman from my old nonprofit days, Darla, who managed low-income housing downtown. She owed me a favor. I texted her from a burner phone I kept for emergencies. "Need a unit, tonight, no records. For a pregnant woman in hiding." She replied in under a minute. "Corner of 7th and Maple, apartment 3B, keys under the mat, no questions." I memorized the address, then deleted the message. At 4 a.m., I woke Clara. "We're leaving," I said. She didn't argue, just nodded and got dressed. We drove in silence as the sky shifted from black to gray. Clara stared out the window, one hand gripping the door handle, the other on her belly. I kept checking the rearview mirror, not for cars, but for patterns. A truck that slowed too long, a sedan that turned when we did. My shoulders were tight, my jaw clenched. When we hit downtown, I finally told her where we were going. She didn't ask how I'd gotten it or who owned it. She just whispered, "Thank you." At 7th and Maple, I turned the corner and saw it. A 3-story brick building with peeling paint and a flickering street lamp. No sign, no name, just a door and a rusted staircase. I parked, grabbed the go bag, and walked her to the stoop. The key was there, just like Darla said. Inside, the apartment was small but clean. Cinder block walls, linoleum floors, a kitchenette, one window facing the alley. No view of the street. Perfect. Clara set her things down and leaned against the wall like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. "No one knows we're here," I said. She nodded. "Not even me until now?" I showed her the fire escape, the back door, the nearest bus stop. "If you hear anything strange, you leave. Don't wait. Don't call me first. Just go." She hugged me then, tight, like she was storing up strength. "I'm not scared anymore," she said. "Not like before." I wanted to believe her. I almost did. But fear doesn't vanish overnight. It just changes shape. What she meant was she wasn't paralyzed anymore. And that was enough. I left her with groceries, a prepaid phone, and strict instructions. No social media, no calls to old friends, no mentioning the address to anyone. Not even Sarah. As I drove home, I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I didn't scan every passing face for danger. I didn't check if a car was following me. I started checking exits instead, where I could turn, where I could run, where I could hide if I had to. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation, and it felt like power. That night, back in my empty house, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything Richard had said. Every word, every pause. I called Ruiz again and gave him the notes. "File it as a supplemental report," he said. "We'll add it to the file. If he violates, this pushes it to felony stalking." I hung up and stared out the window at the dark street. The patrol car was gone. The neighborhood was quiet. But I didn't feel alone. I felt focused. Richard thought he'd scared me. But all he'd done was confirm what I already knew. He wasn't done. And neither was I. The next morning, I met Clara for coffee at a diner 6 blocks from her new place, just in case. She looked tired but calm. She'd slept through the night. No nightmares. No flinching at the clatter of dishes. We didn't talk about Richard. We talked about baby names, about her cravings, about the way the sunlight hit the kitchen in the afternoon. Normal things. For a few minutes, we were just a mother and daughter again. Not survivors, not fugitives, not victims. Just us. And that, more than anything, told me we were going to be okay. While helping Clara pack her old things, with 2 officers standing guard in the hallway and another checking each room before we entered, I opened the drawer of her nightstand and pulled out a thick, worn Bible. I remembered giving it to her at her high school graduation, the one James insisted on picking out because every woman needs a compass. I flipped it open to check if there was anything loose inside, and that's when I felt it. A small, leather diary, bound with a faded blue ribbon, tucked between Psalms and Proverbs. My fingers froze. I glanced toward the bedroom door. Clara was across the hall, carefully folding sweaters with a detective watching over her. And then I opened it. Page after page, in Clara's neat script, laid out Richard's rules. No talking to male co-workers, even about work. No wearing sleeveless shirts, even in summer. No leaving the house without texting him first, including walks around the block. Dates, times, punishments when she broke them. My stomach twisted. This wasn't discipline. It was a prison sentence written in ink. And then I hit the last entry, dated just 2 days before the dinner that shattered everything. "Mom thinks I'm weak. She survived Dad and James. Why can't I survive this?" The words punched through me like a knife. I closed the diary fast, like it might burn me, and walked into the hallway, out of Clara's sight. Leaned against the wall near the linen closet and pressed the leather to my chest. My eyes stung, then burned, and before I could stop it, tears spilled over, hot, silent, furious. Not just at Richard, not just at me. All those years I'd told Clara about surviving James, about working nights after he left, about studying on the bus with my eyes half shut. I'd made it sound like strength was silence, like gritting your teeth and swallowing the pain made you noble. I never told her how I cried in diner bathrooms, how I shook every time a man raised his voice, how I checked every window before bed for years. I'd let her think being strong meant never asking for help. And now she was comparing herself to a version of me that never really existed. She thought she was failing because she couldn't endure what I had, but I hadn't endured it. I'd escaped it, and I'd never made that clear enough. I wiped my face with my sleeve, took a breath, and slipped the diary into my coat pocket. This wasn't just her shame. It was mine, too. Back in the bedroom, Clara handed me a box of old photos, mostly from before Richard, she said softly. "I don't want to keep any from the last 2 years." I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. We worked in silence for a while, sorting, folding, boxing. The officers stayed polite but distant, giving us space. When the last bag was zipped and labeled, I touched her arm. "Can we talk for a minute? Just us." She looked wary but nodded. We sat on the edge of her bed, the same one she'd slept in as a girl when she stayed over after soccer practice. I pulled the diary from my pocket and handed it to her. Her face went pale. "I didn't mean for you to see that," she whispered. "I know," I said, "but I needed to." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't want you to think less of me." "Oh, baby," I said, my voice cracking. "I could never. But I need you to know something. You weren't weak for feeling trapped. You were human, and I made a mistake." I took a breath. "I let you think surviving abuse meant suffering in silence. But that's not true. Surviving means fighting, even if fighting looks like walking out the door." "I need to tell you the whole truth," I said, "not the polished version, the messy one." She listened, eyes wide, as I talked about my father's hands on my neck when I was 10, about how I learned to make myself small so he'd forget I was there. I told her about James, how his anger started with slammed doors and ended with me sleeping in a shelter for 3 months before I found the strength to press charges. I thought if I just stayed quiet, if I worked harder, loved better, the pain would stop, I said. But it never does. Quiet doesn't heal. It just lets the rot spread. Clara's eyes filled. So what do? She asked. You fight, I said. Not with fists. With truth. With boundaries. With refusing to let someone else define your worth. Strength isn't silence, Clara. It's saying no when your whole body is trained to say yes. Then she looked up at me. Did you ever tell anyone about Dad? About what he did to you? I shook my head. Not until years later, and by then, it felt too late. It's not too late for me, she said, voice firmer now. No, I agreed. It's not. She reached for the diary on the coffee table and tore out the last page, the one where she called herself weak. She folded it slowly, then dropped it into the fireplace. We watched the paper blacken, curl, disappear into ash. I'm not comparing myself to you anymore, she said. I'm just going to be me. I hugged her then, tight, like I could press every ounce of courage I had into her bones. That's all I've ever wanted, I whispered. For you to be free to be you. Start writing your truth, she said. All of it. I took it and nodded. Later, while she showered, I opened it and wrote my first line. Strength isn't silence. It's showing up, even when you're scared. And for the first time in years, I didn't cross it out. I didn't hide it. I left it right there on the page, bold and unapologetic, like a promise. To her, to me, to every woman who's ever mistaken endurance for courage. That night, I sat her down and told her everything. About my father, about James, about how I'd spent years thinking if I just kept quiet, the pain would stop. It never does, I said. You have to fight. And this time, when I said it, I meant it with everything I had. Ruiz called me into the station to sign affidavits for Richard's arrest, not just for violating the restraining order, but for financial fraud, forgery, and witness tampering. I walked into the precinct just past 8 that morning. The sky still gray with the kind of stubborn drizzle that soaks you without you noticing. My hands were cold but steady. Ruiz met me at the front desk. His usual no-nonsense expression softened just a little when he saw me. We've got him, he said quietly, like he didn't want the whole station to hear. He led me to a small interview room with a metal table and 2 chairs. On the table sat a stack of papers, neat, stapled, labeled. Read each one, he said. Sign at the bottom. You're confirming everything you've told us. The forged deed, the drained accounts, the threats. I flipped through them slowly. Every word was true, every charge deserved. When I signed the last page, my pen didn't hesitate. This wasn't revenge. It was reckoning. Ruiz nodded like he'd been waiting for this moment as long as I had. He's not getting out this time, he said. Not with this much on the table. Her hair was wet from the rain, her coat damp at the shoulders. You're gonna want to see this, she said, voice low. She flipped open the file and slid a photo toward me. Eleanor at a bank downtown, holding a thick envelope. Turns out her late husband didn't die broke. He left $500,000 in a trust, but the estate documents show most of it vanished over the last 6 years. My stomach tightened. She stole it? Lena nodded. Embezzled it, transfer by transfer. And your son-in-law? He set up shell companies to clean it. Used Clara's accounts as a pass-through so it looked like legitimate movement. He wasn't just hurting Clara. He was laundering his mother's theft through her. I stared at the documents. Bank logs, notarized will excerpts, wire transfer trails, all pointing back to Eleanor's greedy hands and Richard's willing help. They'd used my daughter like a human washing machine, scrubbing dirty money until it looked clean. Ruiz whistled low. That's federal now, he muttered. They're both going down. I didn't see the arrests happen. I was still in the interview room, but I heard the commotion, shouting, footsteps, a woman's voice, sharp and shrill. Eleanor. I stepped into the hallway just in time to see them lead her out, wrists bound in front of her, pearls still around her neck like she thought that made her untouchable. She caught my eye and sneered, but there was panic underneath. Richard came next, escorted by 2 officers. His suit was wrinkled, his hair uncombed. He looked smaller somehow, less like the man who'd slapped Clara at dinner, more like a scared boy caught stealing. He didn't resist, didn't argue, just walked with his shoulders hunched, like he already knew the game was over. Ruiz handed me a copy of the booking sheet. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, witness intimidation, violation of protective order, he recited. And now, thanks to Lena, money laundering and embezzlement. He's looking at 10 years minimum. I didn't say thank you, I just nodded. Words felt too small for what I was feeling. I watched from the precinct window as they led Richard out in handcuffs, his head bowed. Rain had started again, light but steady, and it caught in his hair as they walked him to the squad car. He didn't look at me, didn't look at anything. Just kept his eyes on the wet pavement like he couldn't bear to see the world he'd ruined. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, not out of pity, but because I needed to feel something solid. For months, he'd been a shadow in our lives, a threat in the dark, a name whispered in fear. Now he was just a man in a soaked suit, shuffling toward a cell. No grand speech, no dramatic last look, just silence. And for the first time since that night in Clara's kitchen, I didn't feel hate, just relief. It wasn't the sharp, hot relief of victory. It was quieter, deeper. The kind that comes when you finally stop holding your breath after years of suffocating. The monster wasn't gone, but he was caged, and that meant Clara and that baby could finally breathe. I called Clara from the precinct parking lot, standing under the awning to stay dry. She answered on the first ring, voice tight with fear. "Mom? Is everything okay?" "It's over," I said. "They're both in custody. Richard's not coming near you, ever." She was quiet for a long moment. Then softly, "Did he say anything?" "No," I told her. Not a word. She exhaled like she'd been holding it since that Tuesday dinner. "Can I come get you? I want to see you." "I'll be home in 20, I said. "Make tea." I hung up and leaned against the brick wall, watching the rain bead on the squad car windows. Lena walked past, zipping her coat. "You did good," she said without stopping. "You got greedy bastards off the streets." I didn't answer. I just watched the car doors close, first Eleanor's, then Richard's, and felt the weight lift. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Enough to let me drive home without checking the rearview mirror every 3 seconds. Enough to look Clara in the eyes and mean it when I said, "You're safe now." She didn't say anything when I got out of the car, just walked down the steps and hugged me, tight, long, like she was anchoring herself to solid ground. We stood like that in the rain for a full minute, both of us letting go of something we'd carried too long. Inside, she poured 2 mugs of tea and sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd taught her to count with sugar cubes when she was 5. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," I said, "they face what they did. The courts will decide the rest. But you start living again." She nodded, stirring her tea slowly. "I think I can." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. Outside, the rain eased. And for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel like a shelter. It felt like a home. The monster was caged. And we were finally free. This morning, I planted rosemary and thyme in Clara's new backyard. The same herbs James used to grow every spring in our old garden. The soil was soft from last night's rain, cool and rich under my fingers. I didn't wear gloves. I wanted to feel the earth, to ground myself in something real after months of living in fear. Clara sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a light sweater despite the warmth, one hand resting on her belly like she was already talking to the baby, the other holding a mug of ginger tea that sent up thin curls of steam. She watched me dig, quiet, calm, in a way I hadn't seen since before Richard. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Do you think I'll be a good mom?" I stopped what I was doing, wiped my hands on my jeans, and knelt in the dirt beside her. I looked up at her, really looked, and saw not the woman who flinched at car doors, but the girl who used to stay up late asking questions about stars and justice and love. You already are, I said, because you chose her over fear. She blinked fast, like she was stopping tears, and nodded. After I finished planting, we sat together on the steps, shoulders touching, watching bees hover over the neighbor's blooming lavender. The backyard wasn't much, just a small patch of grass, a rusted swing set left by the last tenant. And now 2 neat rows of herbs. But it was ours. No one knew we were here. No one could come knocking with threats disguised as concern. Clara sipped her tea and said, I found a prenatal yoga class downtown, starts tomorrow. I didn't hide my surprise. You're going? She nodded. It's at that community center near the library. You know, the one with the big windows? I did. I'd spoken there once, years ago, about domestic violence resources. I called this morning, she said. Told them I'm 6 weeks along. The woman on the phone, her name's Naomi, she just said, We're glad you're coming. No judgment. No questions about who's with you or why you're alone. Her voice cracked on alone, but she didn't look away. She was done pretending she needed someone else to be whole. Later that afternoon, while Clara napped, I drove to the downtown library and parked in the side lot where the sun barely reached. I walked past the bulletin board where I used to post flyers for shelter donations and saw something new. A bright yellow sign that read, Writing for Healing, weekly workshop, all levels welcome. I stood there for a full minute, heart thudding like I was back in that courtroom. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was possibility. I went inside, signed my name on the clipboard, and paid the $20 fee in cash. The facilitator, a woman with silver braids and kind eyes, handed me a notebook. First session's tonight, she said. Just bring yourself. I almost laughed. Myself. I hadn't trusted that person in years. But today, for the first time, I thought maybe she was worth bringing. I tucked the notebook under my arm and walked back to the car, sunlight glinting off the windshield. Not running, not hiding, just walking. That evening, I told Clara about the workshop over simple scrambled eggs and toast. Our version of celebration. She smiled, really smiled, the kind that lit up her whole face like when she was 10 and won the science fair. You've always told other women's stories, she said. Now it's your turn. I didn't answer right away. I just stirred my tea, thinking about all the nights I'd typed "I need help" into my phone and deleted it. Writing had always been for others, for women in shelters, for letters to survivors, for legal briefs that could save lives, but never for me. Never for the little girl who learned silence to stay safe. Maybe it's time, I finally said. Clara reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'll be right here, she said, while you find your voice again. And just like that, it didn't feel selfish. It felt necessary. As the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, we sat on the porch again. Clara had her yoga mat rolled up by the door. My notebook sat on the step beside me. The air smelled like damp earth and the faint trace of thyme I'd crushed while planting. I didn't think about Richard or Eleanor or even my own ghosts. The father who taught me to disappear, the son who turned my trust into a weapon, the years I spent vanishing so others wouldn't see me shake. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my mind was quiet. No rehearsing escape routes, no checking locks 3 times, no scanning crowds for threats. I just sat there, watching my daughter breathe easy for the first time in years. She tilted her face toward the fading light, eyes closed, one hand on her belly, the other resting on the wooden step like she belonged exactly where she was. And she did. We both did. We weren't surviving anymore. We were living. Not perfectly, not without scars, but fully. Clara had signed up for yoga. I'd signed up for truth. She was growing a life inside her, one that would never know the weight of a hand raised in anger, if I had anything to say about it. And I was finally ready to write my own story, not as a warning or a weapon, but as a testament. We made it out. We chose each other. We chose ourselves. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, casting long shadows across the yard. Clara stood, stretched, and said, I'm hungry again. I laughed, actually laughed, and followed her inside. Tomorrow would come with its own worries, its own steps forward. But tonight, in this quiet house with the smell of herbs drifting through the screen door, we had everything we needed: peace, safety, and the unshakable certainty that no one, no man, no mother-in-law, no past, would ever take this away from us again. If this story reached your heart, I'd be so grateful if you took a moment to let me know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments, because knowing you're out there gives me strength. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Your support helps other women find these stories when they need them most. Thank you truly for listening all the way through, for holding space for my truth, and maybe for your own. There are more real stories like this one here on the channel, each one a testament to survival, courage, and the quiet power of speaking up. With love, respect, and deep gratitude, I'm so glad you're here.